All right, Joe, tell me a funny story.
Wow, funny story.
You got a good joke? Kick this thing off. Went to the dentist earlier today. Like they ask you, they're like, when was the last time you flossed? And I'm like, dude, you were there. I took that off the internet somewhere. Some people think talking about monetary policy is like pulling teeth. Well, let's see. All right, what do you got for us today?
Following up on the topic we touched on last week, what the Fed should be doing. The other thing that's been in the news a lot recently is this idea of Fed independence. So it's pretty well agreed upon by nearly everybody that the Fed and monetary policy in general should be unrelated to politics. It shouldn't be related to the short-term political cycle. It should be separate. Over the past few weeks, this question has been coming up again and again, and it's accelerated recently, I think for good reason, given Trump's recent firing of Lisa Cook, one of the board of governors. So this has been
firing, right?
Yeah, attempted firing. There's no dispute that there's definitely some political pressure being applied over the past few months now. Trump has repeatedly called for lower rates. He's threatened to fire Mr. Too Late multiple times. He went on that awkward tour of the construction site of the Fed building to try to get some dirt on him, or as a gotcha moment or something.
So we're taking a look, and it looks like it's about 3.1 billion. It went up a little bit, or a lot. So the 2.7 is now 3.1.
So there's very clear intention here. So rightfully so, there's been a lot of questions around that. So what I wanted to talk about this week is approach it from the other side a little bit. So not that how much is Trump eroding the Fed independence, but rather how much has political independence already been eroded in recent history. So I'm going to start off with a pair of interviews.
I want to ask you about the Fed, because the president, you were standing next to him in the Oval Office, said he might basically make you one of the most powerful men in the world because he's considering you to become the next chairman of the Federal Reserve. Our CBS polling we just did shows that 70% of Americans want the Federal Reserve to make decisions independently from President Trump, but there's a big partisan difference here. 59% of Republicans say the Fed should be guided by what Trump wants. 41% should be independent of Trump. Mm-hmm. Which Republican camp do you fall into?
Oh, if I were in that survey, then I would say 100% that monetary policy, Federal Reserve monetary policy, needs to be fully independent of political influence,
including from President Trump.
Including from President Trump. The fact is that we've looked at countries that have allowed the leaders to take over the central banks, and what tends to happen is that it's a recipe for inflation and misery for consumers. And so central bank independence is something that, as you saw, there was a hearing this week about that Democrats and Republicans in the White House all agreed about. Now, the question is, has the current central bank been as independent as we would like, as transparent as we would like? And I think that there's some dispute about that, which we could go into if you'd like.
Well, Secretary Bessent went into that in an article in the Wall Street Journal this past week. He talked about the central bank's independence being under threat due to mission creep. There should be an independent, nonpartisan review of the entire Fed, its role in regulation, monetary policy, and research.
That article that she's referring to sort of came across my feed, although it wasn't in the Wall Street Journal that I saw. It was in that International Economy. I think she's grossly overstating them wanting to entirely overhaul the Fed. He never wrote that. He said that there should be, and I'm trying to find the actual language here because I did read this.
Hold on, Luke.
I'm getting ahead of you.
Getting ahead of me here.
All right. I'm ready to go. I did my homework. I got my hand up in class.
We're almost out of time, and I do have a couple more questions to get to. Fed Chair Jerome Powell's term ends in May. On Friday, you started interviewing potential successors. Do you want a Fed chair who will factor in the president's input when it comes to setting interest rates? Is that what you're looking for?
We want someone who has an open mind and will factor in different policies. Because, you go back and you look, Alan Greenspan in the 90s, they realized that we were in the midst of a productivity boom with the internet, with office equipment being used. I think that we are in the midst of an AI productivity boom. So we want someone with an open mind. We have seen that the Fed as I wrote in the Wall Street Journal on Friday and in a longer article in the International Economy, has consistently overstated or overestimated GDP when Democrats are in office, consistently underestimated GDP when Republicans are in office. So we need to get rid of this orthodoxy that has led them to so many mistakes.
You talk about what you wrote in the Wall Street Journal. You say the Fed's independence comes from public trust, but it's worth pointing out the president has consistently criticized Fed Chair Jerome Powell, has leaned on him to lower interest rates. He's trying to get rid of Fed Governor Lisa Cook. Bottom line, Mr. Secretary, will the Fed chair set interest rates or will President Trump?
The Fed chair doesn't set interest rates. The FOMC sets interest rates. So it is a board.
Should President Trump have a say?
And the President Trump is going to make his views known, just like President Biden did. President Biden in the State of the Union, his last State of the Union, said he thought there was going to be an interest rate cut. Senator Warren called for a 75 basis interest rate cut this time this year.
He was coached. Those are some good answers. He was misdirection. Well, not misdirection, but just like
who, Bessent?
Deflection. Yeah, Biden did it.
Coached by
and then
who?
he like. What do you mean?
It's
got a whole
Bessent.
staff.
He's
You seem to think like it's just this has come up before. It's like you don't think there are people who work for them. He's got like a whole.
Well, they set the
how
direction.
many people at Treasury?
No, honestly though, it's like I think this is true though. I think he probably you come up with the. Well, like I said, he came up with the direction, saying, and his whole point is that okay, you're attacking me over and over about the Fed's not being independent because Trump is doing X, Y, and Z. That's true. That's a valid criticism. But what about all of the other instances over recent memory where you could kind of argue the same thing? And so he gives those couple examples with Biden and Warren, whatever. It certainly didn't pick up, I don't even remember them saying that. That doesn't mean they didn't say it. It just means the media did not, think to say this is questioning Fed political independence. But then beyond that, his kind of broader answer is that the Fed's gotten too out of control. So he's kind of answering the question of why is the Fed not going to be independent? Like, why are you doing this? The Fed's already has been compromised politically, he seems to say. And then in the larger paper, he criticizes, it more leans on the actual Fed policies and kind of overestimation of their own abilities to influence the economy. So from that angle, he says we need to revamp the whole thing. But he does have a couple of points in there saying that they've already, or more or less already kind of compromised their political independence along the way.
Are we going to take a close look at the article?
All right, so I've got both actually. I was going to maybe start with the Wall Street Journal one because it's just shorter and more concise.
It's way shorter.
But I've got the full thing too, which I think is
I think
better.
we should look at the full thing because that's what we do here. We like to go into details, yada yada yada. But I was interested as to why is this published in the International? I haven't heard of this magazine, and it's of all the places. I guess they just. I mean, I imagine that the people at Treasury who worked for Bessent reached out to some of the larger publications and was like, "Hey, can we publish?" And they were just like, "It's too long." Because you look at the Fed one; it's just a couple paragraphs.
Well, I think probably a function of both Wall Street. Constraints around mainstream media. Articles on those things are just super short in general. I think
they're
this
really
is
short
a
now.
Magazine or a journal, you kind of say, so you can do a 10-page thing instead of just a 10-paragraph thing.
And that's got to be it.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
It was just made for magazines, but even then, you'd kind of expect this to be able to get published in perhaps a larger magazine. But whatever. I just thought that was interesting.
All right. So this is titled The Fed's New Gain of Function Monetary Policy. So he says up top, overuse of non-standard policies, mission creep, and institutional bloat are threatening its independence. So him and the Trump administration is getting attacked on all sides by saying that they are seriously challenging the Fed's political independence. His answer, more or less, is that it's already compromised. We need to fix it. How strong is that argument? Let's get into it. So he starts off by saying that, as we saw during the COVID pandemic, when lab-created experiments escape their confines, they can wreak havoc in the real world. That's the metaphor here for what's happened to the Fed over, I don't know, the past like 20 years or so. Because in the previous, he praised Alan Greenspan's handling over his term, which ended in 2006. So this is really a focus on roughly the past 20 years or so. So on that initial point, he kind of opens up by saying that all of these extraordinary circumstances around the 2008 financial crisis that prompted these extraordinary responses were unconventional monetary experiments, and the Fed really didn't know what they were doing. And over time, they continued with this. It naturally flowed into the COVID crisis, where the Fed essentially did the same exact thing in concert with a very aggressive fiscal policy as well. And that's led to the inflation that we had. And he details in great length as to how the Fed overestimates their ability to effectively predict what's going to happen in the economy. And so he characterizes that as the gain of function monetary policy experiment. And as you continue going down that line of reasoning, you say that the Fed's independence is being challenged. So one of the lines I highlighted was the Fed's confidence in its powerful new tools, so these unconventional monetary policy experiments, as he calls them, the cutting rates to zero, keeping it there for an extended period of time, multiple rounds of QE, buying up mortgage-backed securities for the first time. All of these things that have never been done before in that way are this grand monetary policy experiment. And he likens it to, he says here, the Fed's confidence in its powerful new tools resemble that of a central planner who assures their subjects the grand scope of their powers and their prescience will lead to inexorable prosperity. So we're also talking about central planning a couple weeks back as well. We see Bessent here kind of pushing back on it in an unrelated opposite angle, but these things are clearly on people's minds.
One of the points that stood out to me that I really liked, a little farther down, he talked about how economic models have political biases. Do you remember that part? I really like that because he said, they're based on certain beliefs around how the economy works. And what he argued, right, and like what he's arguing is that the FOMC had consistently overestimated its own power and what it was able to do. And the evidence it had for that was it took like what it thought the growth rate would be. This was in like 2010. It made the prediction for what the full year 2010 would look like, and then 2011. And it was just consistently overshooting the actuals, just consistently. And he uses that as evidence of like tying back to your point about how maybe different political philosophies in their view, in this case, the ability to stimulate the economy. Like a central bank could do that. Now, I'll leave it to the audience to kind of make the final jump between, which side typically thinks that a central bank or a central body would be the best way to grow the economy. But he was playing with that idea. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Certainly. And he talks about the asymmetry between how they viewed basically how fiscal policy was working as well in different regimes. So, or maybe not just fiscal, but monetary policy as well. He's also arguing that the Fed stepped into fiscal policy. So it's all kind of mishmashed together a little bit.
It said so the Federal Reserve has overestimated the efficacy of spending-based fiscal policy and underestimated the efficacy of tax cuts and deregulation. So, I mean, one is sort of a nod towards maybe Democratic policies, and the other one's a nod towards Republican ones. And he's arguing, we know which side he's arguing, and he's biased on one side or the other, but it's kind of interesting.
So in making that point, he then goes into great detail about why he thinks that's the case. And he does that by looking at the Fed's own projections through time of where it thinks the economy is going over the next following couple of years. And his point is that when it came to their own powers in play, so right after the financial crisis, they felt very confident that growth was going to be really strong. We were going to have great control over everything, and they consistently undershot. On the other side, that tax cut driven supply side policy under Trump, Then he shows that they consistently undershot what they thought GDP growth was going to be as a result of those policies, both of which intended to increase growth. So they overestimate their own ability and underestimate Trump's ability, more or less. And so he says, in November 2009, so this was at the kind of height of the Great Recession. The financial crisis had kind of tied up, but it was really working its way through the rest of the economy, and there was really a great deal of pain at that time. So the Fed had just kind of kicked off some of these unconventional measures. So the Fed forecast that real GDP would be 3% in 2010 and then accelerate further to 4% in 2011, overestimating its ability to, stimulate the real economy. In 2010, that came close, he says, which was 2.8%. But from that point, instead of accelerating, it slowed to 1.6% only in 2011. By the end of 2010, the FOMC still projected 4% annual growth for both 2012 and 2013. But then in reality, those levels were 2.3 and 2.1%. Zeroing in further on the error of those estimates, then he says, during the first 6 years of that regime, the average 1 year ahead forecast error was about 0.6 percentage points. And on a 2 percentage point base that you expect, that's a pretty sizable error. And then he says the Fed's 2-year forward projections overstated real GDP by 7.6%. The economy would have been $1 trillion larger in their projections than it actually was. And he ties that together by saying these repeated misses reveal that the Fed placed too much faith in its own abilities and an expansionary fiscal policy to spur growth. And then on the other side that we started to touch on, conditions shifted when the Trump administration pivoted to fiscal policy towards tax cuts and deregulation to strengthen the supply side. For 3 pre-COVID years, from 2017 to 19, the Fed's 1 year ahead growth forecasts were consistently too low. Yet optimism about fiscal stimulus resurfaced after President Biden's election. The clearest example was the assertion that inflation triggered by the $2.1 trillion American Rescue Plan of 2021 would be, that famous line, transitory. Some prices were temporary, but the FOMC ultimately had to tighten far more than it had anticipated. So that's, I think, the core of how the Fed's overconfidence in its own abilities connects to this kind of political bias a little bit. So the models, they use these really complicated economic models that by design have a really wide margin of error. As a result, you have to make many assumptions along the way. And naturally, there is room for some political bias in some of those assumptions along the way. And that's kind of the idea here. So Democratic policies focusing on the demand side, the Fed was overconfident in its ability in concert with Biden's fiscal stimulus to stimulate the economy. On the other side, they were very pessimistic about the supply side policies that Trump had implemented during his first term. So that's the kind of connection there. I think kind of the core to why he's saying, well, the Fed has already kind of challenged its own independence. And then he lays out this long criticism of how that is. We kind of touched on the core point here, I think, in contrast to that comment by that interviewer that we watched earlier saying something along the lines of, he's advocating for this large-scale rework of the Fed system. He does advocate for some changes. I don't know if it's a full overhaul, but what he does talk about here, he specifically calls out the natural kind of conflict of interest involved in putting monetary policy and bank supervision under the same roof. He says, the Fed alleges it needs to be independent, but is it? Or is it captive to the ghosts of its past and own ego? Monetary policy helped create the housing bubble, and slow recognition by the Fed and others of the warning signs worsened the financial crash. Despite this, the Fed emerged with more powers than it had going in. Alas, these expanded powers and a lack of humility only added further to the Fed's missteps. So in targeting that point about bank supervision creating that conflict, he talks about how the 2010 Dodd-Frank vastly increased supervision policy. Under Fed supervision, it empowered it to designate and regulate systematically important non-banks, mandated annual stress tests, made it the primary overseer of key clearinghouses and payment utilities. The abolition of the Office of Thrift Supervision folded its thrift holding company oversight into the Fed as well, layered on top of Basel III and capital liquidity rules. The Fed itself writes, these changes transformed the central bank from lender of last resort into the dominant microprudential regulator of the United States. And then he says, 15 years on, though, results are disappointing. Look no further than the 2023 failure of Silicon Valley Bank and some of the other smaller ones. These were all firms subject to Fed exams. Supervisors flagged vulnerabilities, but it was not escalated. The core problem is structural. The Fed now regulates, lends to, and sets the profitability calculus for the very banks that it oversees. This is an unavoidable conflict that blurs accountability and jeopardizes monetary policy independence. That conflict feeds back into policy. A Fed worried about exposing its own supervisory failures has a direct incentive to keep liquidity abundant and rates low, lest asset values fall and banks stumble. Conversely, an aggressive anti-inflation stance forces the Fed to admit those failures when tighter policy reveals weak balance sheets. Either way, monetary policy simply becomes hostage to supervisory self-interest. And then his advocacy at the end is empowering FDIC to overtake that point rather than having it all under the Fed.
I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, as someone who worked in markets and as someone who worked and as someone who worked in supervision, me, I feel like we're uniquely placed to assess this. What do you think?
I think, like all things with monetary policy, that's just so viciously difficult to make any predictions with. And it's constantly a game of making the best decision that you can with the information that you had at the time.
Yeah, I guess related to just the regulatory overreach, and I guess what I was curious about when I was asking for is do you think there's a conflict of interest between the monetary policy side and then the supervision side? That's kind of one of the things that he's asking that I think he's touching upon here. He'll say things like, the Fed now regulates. It is unavoidable conflict that blurs accountability and jeopardizes monetary policy independence. So basically, you imagine that there's a Fed who wants to make sure that banks are all super healthy and strong. A Fed worried about exposing it to its own supervisory failures has a direct incentive to keep liquidity abundant and rates low, lest asset values fall and banks stumble. Conversely, an aggressive anti-inflation stance forces the Fed to admit those failures. When a tighter monetary policy reveals weak balance sheets. Do you think that's a legit criticism? I don't. I think one of the things that there's a very big, and just from experience in working with the Fed, there's a very, very tall wall between supervision and the markets group.
Yeah.
As you know, I mean, they do this intentionally.
Yeah, it's like you and I know that perfectly well. You were
the only reason we really know each other is because we were just part of the same summer internship, and there's a whole group of us that all got together. That's why we know each other. Otherwise, supervision and markets, they don't commingle. They don't really talk to each other, and it's intentionally made that way. The way I understand it is the markets group is calling up banks all the time and is asking them for insight into just the market and even their own bank specifically. But they know that they don't want the police necessarily to listen in, the police being this supervision. And they'll say look, talk to us. The markets group, tell us something honest. We won't tell supervision. I mean, they make they make this quite explicit.
And not that we won't tell supervision. We were very carefully instructed on this. It's that we can't tell supervision. And there is this very delicate balancing act with trusts. How much do the banks trust you saying that? So it was very, very clearly outlined to us. Here's how you communicate that. It has to be done. This is very important to us.
Yeah. And one of the things that's kind of curious, though, is the fact you have somebody like Mickey Bowman now. She's the head of supervision, essentially. She's the head of supervision. But then she's also setting the monetary policy. Now that at that specific, in that specific brain, there might be a slight conflict of interest, but in general, monetary, whether or not a bank lives or dies is not due to monetary policy. It's not, you want to, I think this is a bad point that he makes. Obviously, maybe I am biased. I probably am biased because I worked at the Fed. I do like the Fed. Surprise, surprise. But the fact that he can kind of list off, the results are disappointing, and the fact that there have been bank failures, some of them very large bank failures, like Silicon Valley Bank, I think is sort of nitpicky. Well, not nitpicky. Nitpicky maybe isn't the right thing. These were huge things, but it
doesn't really that strongly support his central argument, I think.
He's basically saying that putting supervision under the Fed was disappointing. It didn't work because of these bank failures. And this is getting to the heart of one of the hardest things in the supervisory world. It is, if a day goes by and there aren't any bank failures, you don't get celebrated. All there is, all the incentive is on the downside. The incentive is just for something bad not to happen. And it's because of stuff like this. If one big bank fails, then all of a sudden supervision doesn't work. It doesn't even have to fail. I mean, the other examples he listed here were like Wells Fargo sales practices and the London Whale. Those banks are fine. But the idea that, okay, well, if you're going to make these arguments, then you have to be open to the idea of just making supervision even a tighter leash, which you don't want. And you gotta let this stuff happen. Silicon Valley Bank, SVB is a super interesting case in terms of, interest rate risk and all that stuff. I imagine, I wasn't in the room when these discussions were happening, but the fact is, they did cite some issues and concerns. What got them comfortable with it was that, they turned everything, it was like an accounting thing. They just turned everything over to HTM. And they said, we don't have to recognize these mark-to-market things. The only reason why it became a concern was somebody asked was if these were AFS, this bank would be underwater. It's very hard because the banks, they don't, it's tough in these interviews, and I've been on both sides of the table. I've been on the supervision side and I've been on the other side, on the private side. And, it's tough. I mean, these people across the room can get you in trouble. And, you do everything you can. You present information in the best way that you possibly can in order to stay out of that trouble. Naturally. And so a lot of things a good regulator needs to know is to read between the lines and all that stuff. But you're all very much at the kind of the mercy of the people that are feeding you information, which are the same people that don't want to get in trouble. That's what you have to work with. I guess one of the other things I'll say kind of about the Silicon Valley Bank thing and just supervision in general, I think one of the best thing a regulator can do is it's also very much against their instinct, which is to just don't be afraid of looking stupid, really stupid. And that's just very hard. When you're in a very fancy boardroom and you just got to ask what are seemingly super dumb questions? What does this number mean? Or describe this graph. I don't understand this graph. Stuff and then they'll talk kind of down to you and you just kind of have to take it. It's one of the signs, I've been in rooms and what I thought were great regulators were the ones that were not afraid to just ask really dumb questions. That's definitely one of the challenges to kind of get over that ego hurdle as a regulator and then the supervisory folks. But you just have to admit that you also have to kind of go in there very humble and acknowledge the fact that these are their models, which you do not know. You might, might have the Excel or something, but to decode these things is incredibly complicated. You can't do it overnight. And there are people who actually built them up, and they're going to talk you in circles and stuff like that. And you'll never quite understand. And the meeting sort of gets kind of too long and you have to end it somehow. And the next thing you know, you don't still totally understand it. And they've just kind of run out the time. It's tough. Even so, they did identify issues with Silicon Valley Bank. But the other issue is the fact that it is not the role of the regulator. The regulator cannot run these banks. That's the other thing. You do not run the bank. Management, you're just trying to make sure that management is aware of the risks. They're either accepting it or they're doing something to combat it. The thing that you're trying to figure out is if there's a risk in there that is not being reported to management and management does not know about, right? So if a management team says, look, we are aware of these risks and we are comfortable with them, there's not a whole lot more a regulator could do, because then you're no longer I'll just kind of tie back thing to the Jack Ma discussion when he started talking about Tianguan and that word regulation is a combination of the words supervision and management. If you're going in there and you're managing something, that's not what you're no longer supervising.
Right. You're managing.
You're managing. If you're saying, look, you have too much risk, take it down. Regulators don't do that.
I think this is all just highlighting the highly nuanced nature of not even how to carry out bank supervision. To what extent should banks be supervised? And when does supervision turn into management? Pulling that all back to the initial point, though, Bessent uses these failures as an example of why the Fed is broken, and it's broken in part because they're already politically biased. After this conversation, and from the start, I was always kind of iffy on his argument there, but even more so now, it just seems like quite a stretch to me.
If we wanted to make the argument for the Fed is politically biased, what would you say? I've got a couple things from the supervision, from my time there in supervision. Maybe there's one example. One of the bigger ones that came to me was the idea of, and it was recently pulled back, there was a big push when I was there to start to try to calculate climate change related risks, like a bank. So a bank had to just have their finger on the pulse of how much climate change is going to impact them. That's clearly there's a political tinge to climate change. And just recently, maybe you can, I don't know if it was a letter or whatnot, but they basically said, like, you're no longer considering sort of climate change as its own separate thing. It's sort of rolled in with all the other risks. Like, we have to trust the bank to understand that climate change is something on their radar. It doesn't have to be its own separate thing. That would be like one example in which I think politics started to get a little too far into the Federal Reserve. We're doing we weren't doing like explicit climate change studies, or climate change like exams, but the word was being thrown around. One of the things that happened under our tenure, I think it was the first time ever, John Williams put up the pride flag outside the New York Fed.
Oh,
while we were there. Do you remember that?
I do now.
Clearly a political statement.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think he should have done that. Just besides that, it's giving fodder to people like Bessent, general critics of the Fed and stuff like that. The fact that it's a political institution, and there is clearly a political association with that flag. That's all there is to it.
Certainly. Or even just it has nothing to do with monetary policy. Why put it there at all? Like, it's not like this is something that's being taken down. It's being consciously put up.
It was the first time ever, I think. Yeah. It was under him. And then the fact that they kind of wrote in over there with like the FOMC and the donations had like shifted before. It was pretty well split. Now it's shifted over to Democrats, donations to the Democrats. That's probably true.
This is definitely an interesting topic, interesting conversation, but I was thinking about it from like, how can Bessent possibly be defending Trump for pretty clear political interference?
It's pretty clear. No, to be clear, I mean, to our audience, I definitely think that this like political, I mean, Lisa Cook and trying to get at her for mortgage applications or something. I mean, that's lawfare. Like, let's call it.
So Bessent's response is saying, well, more like he's implying, that's fine. Look at how bad the Fed is. We're going to fix it. Here's how politically compromised they've already become, which I think is pretty flimsy. And, going through it as well, like we've been doing here, I think it's a really tough connection to make. Whereas the current environment, it's like really obvious. It's blatant, encroaching on the Fed's political independence.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of looking at the article, it said like, the Fed's political independence is absolutely critical, right? And I guess, almost the position here that the article is taking is that it needs to do these things so that it can, maintain its independence.
Exactly. And, that's the same message that Hasset had. Obviously, those guys behind the scenes I'm sure they agreed on that central point. They have to defend what's going on somehow. What better way to do so that, listen, we agree with you. We're trying to fix mistakes of the past without directly addressing here's why these current things that Trump has done would address them, which they wouldn't.
One of the other things I thought was interesting was that they employed some sort of left-wing arguments as to like why these new unconventional monetary policy approaches are wrong. And they had this little like side segment in there. The Fed's policy, socialism for investors, capitalism for everyone else, where they talked about the Fed put, and basically that if the Fed starts to see asset prices, which are owned by the rich, start to go down, then they're going to come in and save the day. And that's sort of affected, and that's one of the reasons why the rich are getting richer, and the poor are not increasing their wealth as quickly. And then they cite a progressive. I think, the article makes a point to call her a progressive financial policy expert, the Petro, and then just give it like the worst possible picture, I guess they could find, and put it up there.
Nice.
I mean,
yeah.
That was definitely, I think that was a nitpicky bit. I mean, you could find someone write a book about anything and then just say that. So, I sort of skimmed over that because I feel as though a lot of this is going to be.
Me too.
Not that her point isn't probably valid and it's not like an interesting book or anything like that. It's just it feels like one of those high school essays where like you want to make a point, you go find the one book that supports it, you put it out there and like, I proved it. There's a book. Someone wrote a book about this, so it must be true. Without giving it like really, breaking down its points. I don't know. Little high school work, little high schooly from Bessent there. But
yeah, I mean, he's got a central thesis that he must project and defend. So he's always starting from this point. What's Trump going to do next? I've got to defend it. So I'm a little sympathetic in that regard, at least structuring the argument. But either way, it's going to be really interesting from here because Powell is on his way out in less than 6 months now, and there could potentially be another board member that he names, and so it'll be really interesting to see what the outcomes truly are in the end. Are they going to continue to underestimate GDP growth under Trump's policies and then swerve again in the future, or were these coincidental points that he cherry picked and he's just got to defend the big man and move on?
Yeah. One other thing interesting, the other side little box that they had in the article on the international economy was on institutional growth at all costs. That was always interesting. I really was curious. Again, this is going back into the human dynamics part as to why these institutions just continue to grow. It's always they're always just like growing, and they mean that both just what their mission is starts to creep outward, how many people they have, what their budget is. It just always seems to go up. One of the big bits of criticism he had was that the staff at the Fed, is growing, faster than the population. And I guess one thing I'd take from that is like everyone, like maybe this is just kind of one of these observations that I have, just generally working in corporate, the corporate world for all these years. I think, everyone that works in like a certain position, I guess, wants to think or just intuitively thinks they're very important and they do a lot of, really good work, and they don't necessarily understand what other departments do. And they just assume that it's not as important as the work that they do. And, over time you can arm yourself with arguments as that prove that or suggest as much. So I think one of the ones that I had when I was working at the New York Fed is if you look at the number of people who are actually working on a given bank or something, we were like one of the metrics could be like the number of regulators per $1 billion in total assets of the banks that you supervised, and we would point at the fact that the number of regulators per billion, and that ratio is relatively low compared to other supervision departments. So we were like, look, we're doing so much work. We're like, working harder than all the other supervision folks. Why is that? And you just make a case for like why you're not, you don't have enough resources. And the only ones that are pushing back is like, there might be the executive office that will like push back on, the budget that you give them. But at the end of the day, it's just like a very small office compared to the whole weight of the whole bank, and everyone asking for more resources.
Pretty good discussion. That's all I brought for you this week, Luke. For all you at home, hopefully that was stimulating, to say the least.
Not as stimulating as the fiscal policy.
It can't be. That was just too great. Well, thanks for tuning in. This is the Root of All Evil podcast. I'm Joe.
I'm Luke.
We'll see you next time.